not only is it, contingent on the crops we grow for the work that the farmer and nutritionists do to balance that diet, but also it even starts a little sooner than that.
Hello, and welcome to the Dairy Podcast Show. This is Mark Thomas from Dairy Health and Management Services, and we have a great opportunity this morning to have Joe Lawrence from Northern New York, his second time on the Dairy Podcast Show, to join us today. So good morning, Joe.
Morning, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Great to have you, and great to see you. Joe and I have known each other for many, many years.
Yeah.
I originally lived in Northern New York, the Lowville area, and that's where Joe currently lives and works with his family. So it's great to reconnect. Also, had quite a few years of on the board of Cooperative Extension, where Joe worked as a crop educator. So we'll have Joe give a little background about how he got started in the agronomy area in Northern New York, but also had some opportunity to work with Joe while I was on the board. So Joe, tell the audience a little bit about your background. You grew up in the North Country, and how you got to your current position.
Yeah, thank you. So I grew up on a small dairy farm in northern Jefferson County, right along the Canadian border, and after college, had the opportunity to join the extension system, and as Mark said, as a field crops educator in Lewis County, and got to work with Mark quite a bit there, which was always a good time. So I was in that position for I don't know, 6 or 7 years, and then and through that time, my primary responsibilities were in field crops, but we had a nice team effort around a lot of forage management topics. So it really kind of sparked my interest in what happens to the crops after we harvest them, and the feeding aspect. So I'm by no means a nutritionist. I don't have any training there, but I've applied my field crops background to thinking about growing and harvesting and storing crops for dairy cattle. So then I spent a few years in private industry as a crop consultant here locally in the North Country, and then in 2016 I had the chance to join the Pro Dairy program at Cornell with a dairy forage management position, which really encompassed a lot of what I had worked on in my career prior to that, and has been really a nice fit of combining the crop management and forage harvest and storage management aspects of what I've done before.
When your goal is to help animals reach their full potential, health matters. Diamond V offers a fresh perspective on animal health, a perspective that supports gut health, strengthens immunity, and ultimately enhances performance. For those who choose to invest in keeping healthy animals healthy, feeding Diamond V makes a statement about another dimension of profit, where margins are measured by confidence in your future. To get a fresh perspective, visit diamondv.com, because animal health deserves a healthier approach.
I guess one thing that I remember really well is, lots of on-farm management meetings and team meetings that we had, especially led through Extension and a lot of the programs that Franz Vokey and Peggy Murray and you worked on collaboratively. But I guess one thing that I see is so important is, in terms of nutrition and animal health, is really working with the crop specialist or the agronomist, because it all really starts with you guys, right? I mean, if we don't have good forage for all the processes that take place in terms of field preparation, planning, harvest, storage, so forth, feed out, then the nutritionists, the veterinarians need to deal with the downstream effects of that poor quality forage that lasts, a year or more. So can you tell us a little bit about your role in Pro Dairy, and obviously years of experience of having that opportunity, but the collaboration of you said you're not a nutritionist, but you probably really are, right? From what you do, you feed cows, right? Just in a different way than the person balancing the ration.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think you raise a good point. That really, I really consider that a foundation for all of my career, is some of that really collaborative work, both within the team we had at Cooperative Extension and with the allied industry folks such as yourself, that we would often have team meetings on farms. And I quickly realized that not only is it contingent on the crops we grow for the work that the farmer and nutritionists do to balance that diet, but also it even starts a little sooner than that. One popular kind of trend that ebbs and flows over the years is the idea of some of these alternative crops for forages. And I recall early on, and this is something I've been getting questions about again the last few years because it's kind of back in the news. But if we decide as a farm to try some of these alternative crops, and we have a small amount of them on the farm, we don't always ask the question, who are we going to feed these to, or where are we going to store them? And so sometimes you have a small amount of this very different crop, and then without really a plan of who it's going to be fed to or how many months worth of feed you have. So going all the way back to the planning process, getting your nutritionists involved even before you plant the crop, to say, hey, these are the crops I'm thinking about planting. This is the expected yield. How many, this is what we could expect in terms of quantity of this forage. Is this really useful to any group of animals on my farm? And does it make sense to plant it? So I think those conversations really need to start before planting even happens. And then, once stuff is in the ground, again, thinking about the quantity of each crop you're going to have, and where you're going to put that in storage in order to best utilize it for the animals. So that's really continues to be the focus of a lot of this, and kind of, I often say I attempt to take a whole farm approach to the forage management topic, because right from the soil types you have and the crops you have the ability to grow in the climate you're farming in, to the selection of the crops, and what we do with them after harvest is all got to be a team conversation between the farm, the agronomist, the nutritionist, and veterinarian, anyone else that's involved in that picture.
That's a really excellent point, Joe. And at the end of the podcast, we asked what separate out the star producers, if you will, and maybe I'll answer that now. And it's just inventory planning and management, right? Because how many times do we run into either not having enough forage, and whether that's homegrown, purchased, combination, and then you have to scramble and what do you feed? We're feeding ruminants. There's a minimal quantity of forage we need to feed these critters. But on the other side, then, yeah, okay, here's the feed stuff. Okay, well, where does this fit? Well, gee, it doesn't really fit at all. Maybe if you had some backyard horses, we could we could feed it. But so that's a great point of, okay, we're going to grow this, or did you now just grow something that we can't utilize well and we're short on some other product, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's different for a cover crop, but effective utilization of the land. I guess from your experience, what would you say some of the most major advances there's been just in even the last few years of harvest and storage? Those folks that really maximize the feed out of what they grew and harvested?
Yeah, I think, well, maybe we're going back more than a few years, but on the hay crop side, um, I remember a time where first cutting, and this is, a Northeast perspective, but the first cutting was, often kind of wasn't necessarily the highest quality, but you had to harvest it to get onto the rest of the cuttings, right? And that's really flipped on its head now that we do a much better job with our timing of our first cutting, and we see that we often get some of the best digestibility of that hay crop forage in the cooler spring conditions. So if we can harvest that early, and that often ends up being the preferred feed on the farm now, and the newer metrics we have for evaluating forage quality and fiber digestibility and stuff like that show us that sometimes those mid-season second, third cuttings of the hay crop aren't as good as we once considered them to be, in part because in that hotter part of the summer they may not be quite as digestible. On the corn silage side, kernel processing has been around for several decades now, but continues to be something that farms are doing a better job with, and is really opening up their ability to utilize that starch. So, we get a forage test back and it has starch content and starch digestibility on it. I like to add a third component of starch availability. And because we can have the highest starch content and the highest digestibility of any corn hybrid on the market, but if we're not doing a good job with our kernel processing, that is still not going to be available like it should be to the rumen.
Those are some really interesting points, Joe, of, just through, obviously there's been changes in agronomy practices and hybrids and so forth like that, but, just timing alone, being able to capture a window of a forage that once was maybe less quality or considered less quality, when now that's obviously a huge percentage of yield of the total crop, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you can now use for lactating cows, where at one time perhaps that was considered an inferior forage. As you talk about corn silage and digestibility and starch availability, tell us a little bit about some of the plot trials you've done. I know that's something you've been really involved with, and a lot of that data we've used in our role of helping guide clients, producers in terms of different hybrids and growing days and so forth. Uh, Tell the group here a little bit about how you do those plots and the data, and especially the independence of that data, right? Pro dairy, you're doing that independently, which is real important for the industry.
Yeah, thanks. So it really is a partnership with the seed companies. They enter hybrids. We offer a program where they can enter hybrids each year. So obviously, without their partnership on it to enter the hybrids, we wouldn't have a program. So I always want to acknowledge that. And so what we do is we take these hybrids that are entered each season, and we, as a third party organization, we plant all of these hybrids from multiple companies side by side at various locations across New York. And we also partner with the University of Vermont. So we have locations in Vermont as well. And these hybrids are all grown and replicated trials side by side in the same growing environments. And at the end of the year, we produce a report, which I'm actually working on, the 2023 report today, that shows the difference in performance between these hybrids, both yield, and we report numerous quality metrics that you would expect from your standard forage quality analysis. And then another tool we utilize is the CNCPS program from Cornell, which is a model for balancing diets. And we use that in a little different way than a nutritionist would use it to balance diets. We essentially build a standard diet, and then uh, we take out what we consider kind of an average corn silage analysis, and then insert the analysis for each of these hybrids and look at what the quality metrics of that hybrid do to our predicted milk yield. So the key numbers that we kind of highlight in our report are obviously the crop yields, and then a predicted milk yield for each hybrid using these values. So it's not how a nutritionist would use it, because if a nutritionist put in a new corn silage, they would then tweak other parts of the diet to rebalance the ration, right? We're not doing that. We're trying to use this as a tool to understand the differences in the quality of each of these hybrids. And so by using the tool that way, we get some differences in predicted milk yield. And I will say, back to what we continue to learn, to your previous question, is among the, really top genetics in the industry right now for corn hybrids, of the conventional hybrids, it's a pretty tight race there. But what we often see is a lot more variability between growing environments and locations. So what we've really been focusing on and trying to investigate more is collecting as much weather data as we can, and looking at the influence of specific weather patterns during the season on the resulting quality. Another way we look to utilize that, in addition to just looking at how each individual hybrid performed, is categorizing how all of the hybrids at a location performed relative to the weather data. And we think there's a real opportunity there for farms to use the data in that way, in looking at the weather that they had at their specific location, and finding the results in our report that most closely match that, even if it was a location that was across the state from where you were. You may have similar precipitation patterns, similar growing degree days. And so we think there's a real opportunity to use the report in that way to essentially calibrate your mind and say, all right, this is the average of all these hybrids under these growing conditions. So now I know what I should have expected out of performance on my own farm, and did the crop I grew this year kind of match those expectations? And can I use this data when I'm selecting hybrids from the company to say, this is what we should expect out of the growing season, and ask the company to provide their internal data to see how their hybrids matched up to that.
So Joe, obviously I'm connecting here from Torreon, Mexico, so very, very different climate than northern New York, as I know well, having lived in both locations now. But those differences are significant, but are they so significant? Would there be any value in using that hybrid data at all, for instance, from New York, Vermont, or is it just completely not even of any use in terms of looking at the West, the West Coast, Midwest, here in a very arid, high desert environment?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question, and I'm not quite sure how to answer it. I think the way we present the results, we offer the information in terms of so what we use is we call a percent of plot mean. So instead of reporting that the yield maybe was 25 tons per acre, we report it as a percentage of what the average yield was at that location. So a hybrid might be 110% of the average. So that one hybrid performed 10% better than the average at that location, or it could be 95%. So it was 10% or 5% lower yielding than the average at that location. So while there's some real differences, especially when we think about rain-fed systems versus irrigated systems, I think that there still could be some value in looking at those percent of plot means and how consistently that hybrid performs. Because if it's 10% above the plot mean at every location, that's suggesting that there's some consistency there in its performance across multiple growing environments. So will that translate directly to the West Coast or into the South? No, not directly, but I think it still offers up some indications of how that hybrid tolerates stress, how consistent its performance is.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting, and I guess that makes sense, right? That it's a consistently performing hybrid, and therefore it could use that at least for some relative ranking amongst other hybrids.
And obviously, we're not the only university that does this. And there's some, private companies as well that are, utilizing data on a larger scale to try to collect some of this. So I always even folks here in New York, I encourage them to use other sets of data besides ours. And I would certainly encourage that outside of the Northeast. Ours is just one piece of data that can be used in conjunction with others. And I don't want to suggest that we should use this across all environments. I just think the more pieces of data that you collect in the decision making process, it allows you to get an idea of how how consistent a product might be performing, right?
Joe, how have you seen, so you've been doing this for years now, the adoption of that information and utilization of such? So could you attribute, that within herds that use, this data, they have certainly seen, I mean, it's obviously very difficult to say that's the cause and effect, right? But
Mm-hmm.
definitely an improvement in quality and or also herd performance based on that data? Has it extrapolated to more milk?
I honestly can't answer that. And a lot of the feedback, frankly, I get is actually more from nutritionists than some of the allied industry than directly from farmers. So I would go back to the consistency piece. I think what I do here is that it's not extrapolating, directly to more milk or something, but that, farms are finding as they focus in more on utilizing data sources like ours and others in the decision making process, that it's helping with consistency and taking some of the the highs and lows out of year to year. I mean, obviously the weather has a big impact year to year, but we can perhaps take some of the variation out of that with focusing in more on conscious efforts around the selection of our crops and not making drastic changes from year to year based on a reaction to the previous growing season or a new product that's on the market that we don't have a lot of information on yet. Sometimes we react to those things, try them, and it really throws a lot of variability into our feeding program. So I think we could say we've seen some more consistency there.
And that's a good point too. I guess, within this process, just more attention to the entire process, right? Folks that are using that data are more likely to be involved, not just in the selection of the hybrid, their seed, but all the processes of, field preparation and fertilization and so forth. So I guess, important point there.
Yeah. And just one more thing, I mentioned it already, but we're really dealing, in the trials with the top performing hybrids already from most of these companies, right? And someone recently used the analogy to the artificial insemination industry and selecting bulls. Perhaps in the early days of that industry, there was a lot of variability in the bulls you selected. Today I think it's fair to say, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that whatever company you're working with, their top performing bulls are going to bring some similar performance and traits, right? And I think we see that in the crop industry as well as in years past there was more variability between some of the genetics, but now we're really dealing with an industry where there's a very consistent level of high performance across a lot of these companies because of what they've invested in their genetics programs. So when we think about that, we would expect that we're getting the best performers, but it might only be 10% of a company's portfolio, right? If they enter 4 hybrids into our trials, but they have 40 in their portfolio that they're available to customers, we're getting a snapshot of that. So that's, again, why we really encourage the data to be used in conjunction with other sources to say this is an indicator of what good performance was for this season, and now, but maybe there isn't a hybrid in the program that specifically meets my needs. So asking your seed representative, what other hybrids do you have in your portfolio that more align with my needs but show performance characteristics comparable to what this third-party data is showing we should be expecting.
That's a really good point, Joe, that, really the playing field has been leveled, so to speak, right? Like, and I think you make a good point, across all the bull studs, you're probably not going to have some go wrong with any bull they offer to some extent. Some people may disagree with that, but in a commercial dairy setting, right, that these studs are selecting good sires. So likely a reputable seed company is going to have, certainly a range, but a more level playing field. I guess given that, what is the range of differences there? So you're selecting the top, and you said that obviously environment, weather plays a significant role. So I think that's really important point. Within that, what is the spread? You're working on that now. Is it pretty narrow, or are there some outliers that don't perform well? But then can you potentially explain that again by this year's growing season?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know if I can put a number to it off the top of my head. I mean, we will see, we will see, like on the yield side, there could be a, 4-ton per acre yield difference from highest to lowest at a location, which seems significant on the surface, right? But then because we're doing this replicated work, first we got to ask ourselves, what are the statistics behind this? And sometimes we present it in terms of a least significant difference, or an LSD. So sometimes, given the variability of doing field work, the LSD could be 2.5 tons per acre. So we have to really, pay attention to that and say, even though there was this difference in average yields, we have to get up to a relatively high number before we say it's significantly different. And where was I going with that? Oh, and the other thing that really helps explain some of it a lot of times is dry down. And, you mentioned before about selecting based on relative maturity or days needed from planting to harvest. And that's definitely a factor that contributes. If we and this isn't so much a comment on our trials, so we do see it in our trials, but on a commercial dairy, if you're selecting hybrids that are really stretching the length of your growing season, and you're just not able to get those to dry down into what we would prefer the mid 30s for a whole plant dry matter content, you're really sacrificing a lot there in terms of both yield and quality. We see where, harvesting even in the low 30% for whole plant dry matter, which used to be kind of considered acceptable, versus so if you just, if you're harvesting at 31%, 32%, and you can be patient and you select the right hybrids, and you can wait and get that up to 35, 36% whole plant dry matter, you could be looking at an additional, 1.5 to 2.5 tons per acre right there, because you're allowing those kernels to mature and add more starch. And that's really where your yield increase is coming from at that point in the growing season. The plant itself isn't changing that much, but you're getting more starch, which adds to your overall yield, and obviously also increases the starch content of the silage. So within our trials, that's another thing we try to control for, but we have to be realistic. We can't feasibly harvest every hybrid on the exact day it hits 35% dry matter. So we have a range in dry matters, and we can explain some of our, yield differences and starch differences with that as well. So yeah, I think it really highlights selecting the hybrids that you're confident can make it to silage maturity in your growing environment.
And I guess highlights just about everything we do in the dairy industry, multifactorial, right?
Yeah.
We get these questions: what's causing my high Semitic cell count? Why is fat not where we want it? So forth and so on. Uh, it's not one thing. It's not pick this hybrid and you're going to have success. It's everything that goes into that process.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously it's different where you're living now, but in our northern climate, just even going with a little shorter season hybrid to give yourself flexibility, because one, we see that our shorter season hybrids are much more competitive yield wise than they were maybe 30 years ago when you look at data from back then. But also, again, we can actually gain more yield by waiting for it to dry down. And as you well know, Mark, as we face up here in northern New York, it could be a matter of there's a frost in the forecast next week, or there's some remnants of a hurricane coming up the East Coast that's going to dump a bunch of rain on us. And that might prompt a producer to say, I know my crop's not quite ready, but I'm going to go harvest it this week because the fields could be really muddy next week, right? And it's dry right now. So what I really push is, well, let's back off our relative maturities a little bit so that we're in the driver's seat and we have more opportunity to select our harvest timing and wait for it to be ready, rather than having some weather event circumvent that and drive our harvest timing.
Great point there. That's obviously super relevant in different regions of the country. Joe, to go from the kind of the other direction, how have you seen, again, because you've been doing this for quite some time now, how have the seed companies used the data? Obviously, they're very interested in this data when it's available.
Yeah.
Where have you seen their strategies, which I imagine gets all the way back to research and hybrid development?
Yeah, there's obviously a big spread in the different companies in terms of where they invest their own research, but a lot of the companies we're dealing with that have a presence here in the Northeast, they have their own research trials in the area, but they value ours for a couple reasons. One, it adds more locations to their data set, right? So it allows them to get data on additional growing environments without having to do the work themselves. I mean, they do a lot of work themselves, don't get me wrong, but it adds to their portfolio of locations. And again, I think most of them would say their preferred way to use this would be to be able to highlight the performance of these hybrids within the context of, that it's third party data, and that it's their hybrids are being grown side by side with hybrids from other companies. So I think they like to bring that into the picture, but ultimately most of the time they're going to bring the producer that they're talking with back to the idea of, this is the entire lineup we have, and here's how these hybrids that were entered in the trials correspond to our internal data. And it gives the producer an opportunity to see, do our trials kind of validate what their internal data is showing, or is there a different picture being drawn with our results? And so I think not that I don't want to suggest that there's anything wrong with their internal data. I think for the most part, all of our companies do a really nice job there. But nonetheless, we're all human. Human nature is to look at where potential biases could come into play, whether they're intentional or not, and in that case, having some additional growing environments and in a third party format can ultimately kind of help bolster the story you're trying to build around the hybrids you have in your portfolio.
And that's a great point. And you also mentioned, the statistics, the data, right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, we many times fall short on this, and evaluating a feed additive, a treatment success, what have you, is we don't really have enough data or enough statistical information to say, is this really different, right? So I think that's a really important point. Yeah, there was a difference here, but is that real?
Right. So, and I think that's an excellent point. And you deal with this all the time as well, as you mentioned. But so there's two parts of that. There's trials like ours that are replicated and do have statistics, but we need to make sure that we're paying attention to what those statistics are telling us, because sometimes we may see a numerical difference that catches our eye, but if ultimately it's not statistically significant, we shouldn't be really putting a lot of weight in that numerical difference, right? And so that's on the replicated trial side. But just as you deal with inside the barn, the other thing is, too often we get a scenario where someone just plants a strip of two different hybrids with no replication at all, or even they may be in different fields, one on one side of the road and one on the other side of the road or something, and then they try to draw some sort of observational conclusions from that, and that really is problematic in terms of, there's just too many variables there. So this isn't my work, but the nutrient management SPEAR program at Cornell has done a lot of work in utilizing technology to implement what they're calling a single strip approach to these sort of field analysis. So utilizing the GPS technology on the planters, on our fertilizer applicators and our sprayers, and then our ability to collect yield data at harvest, and introducing statistically valid methods for farms to do replicated trials within the field at a field scale with their own equipment, and not needing our specialized plot harvesters and stuff. And so I think as our farms gain more of that technology, again, analogous to what's going on inside the barn, right? We can we can track more of that. We have records of it because our machinery is able to document what's going on, and then we can facilitate more valid research on within the field that a farmer can do themselves, and not just have these kind of side by side comparisons that really don't carry a lot of value.
And that's a great point, Joe. I guess your analogy to comparing two fields on different sides of the road would be no different than comparing two pens of very different demographics, or in some cases two different farms, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're feeding this at one farm and not the other farm, and look at the milk response difference. Well, okay, yeah, we know that doesn't hold true at all for all the variables there are. Um, Joe, so what are some of the other projects you're working on within Pro Dairy in terms of really working directly with the producers and having some impact that they can hopefully demonstrate in terms of productivity?
Yeah, uh, in terms of like field research right now, there's not a lot new to report, but I think something that continues to be something that brings me to a lot of farms is evaluating harvest protocols and bunk silo or drive over piles, pits, whatever they're called in different parts of the country. That really still focusing in on better management there. So on the harvest side, we had a project a few years ago now where we were really trying to help producers understand the impact of hybrid on kernel processing for, again, that starch availability piece of corn silage. So there's been a lot of work done by some engineers and others related to improving kernel processing, especially with these high throughput choppers. So we have these choppers that are, putting a lot of tons through an hour. So how do we improve the kernel processing? And we've done a good job there on the engineering front. But sometimes we still get into these scenarios where we just kind of set the chopper at the beginning of the season. The processing score looks good, and we don't always go back and look at the differences as the season goes on and make sure the processor is still doing an adequate job. And so what we did is planted some hybrids with very different characteristics. So we had some big, tall, leafy plants, some shorter statured plants, different relative maturities. So we had different dry matters at harvest, and these were planted on commercial dairy farms. And so what we did there is set up, made sure the chopper on the farm was set up to get what we would consider an optimum processing score before we went into these plots. And then we would go through these hybrids with different characteristics and collect samples to look at the impact of just the hybrid on the processing score, because we didn't change the processor at all. It was set up the same throughout. And what we found is, as you might expect, there's a difference in ear to stover ratio. So we had these big, tall, leafy hybrids, and they actually had in terms of the ear weight, the size of the ear, were very similar to these smaller statured dual purpose hybrids. But because there's more plant there, we're diluting out the ear with more plant content, right? And it seems fairly intuitive that by having more volume of material, more plant going through the harvester relative to the ear, it makes it a little harder for the processor to do its job and really break open those kernels. And we were able to document that was the case. And, we saw going from a leafy hybrid to a dual purpose, and that change in ear to stover ratio, it made anywhere from a 8 to 14 or 15 point difference in kernel processing score with these two hybrids growing side by side in the same field. So that really highlights to a producer, when we think about, an optimum score being over 70 and a adequate being 50 to 70 and inadequate being under 50, if you have just find middle ground and say a 10-point difference in processing score using the exact harvester with the exact same settings, just because you went from a bigger, taller hybrid to a shorter statured one, that could be the difference. That could take you from a 60 down to a 50, or a 75 down to a 65 in processing score, right? So really thinking about as you go through the season, and maybe switching fields, you have different hybrids planted there. The other thing was ear dry matter. So not necessarily whole plant dry matter, but just looking at the dry matter of the ear. As our ears there's kind of a sweet spot. So if the ears are way too immature, processing score can be challenging, or because some of those kernels are still kind of squishy, and they can go through the processor without even really getting popped, so to speak, because they're almost more like a balloon at that point with fluid in them than they are a hard starchy kernel. But on the other end, as things dry down, we also saw where it became more difficult to get a higher processing score as that ear dry matter continued to advance. So, maybe we start harvest and the dry matters are kind of where we want them, and we're getting good processing scores, but it takes us 10 days to harvest everything. And by the time we get into that later part of harvest, we have drier ears, which may be fine. It's probably still going to be really good quality corn silage, but we need to be paying attention, getting out, readjusting those processors, and recognizing these differences that the hybrid itself and dry down can have in those scores, so that we make sure that the scores we're getting at the end of the season are as good as when we started.
Those are all, super important points, Joe, and again, just need to be reiterated, right? With all the potential things that can affect the quality from planning now this time of year for hybrid selection and what fields and inventory, to getting back around to almost a year from now of that harvest and storage. And then obviously now the focus on proper fermentation and feed out. So I think it's really cool, all the opportunities there really are. Instead of challenges, really look at all the potential opportunities you have to really make great quality forage for dairy.
Yeah, and I think I don't know if there's a lot of like real new research in terms of the storage side, right? But I still find it to be a very good topic, and what brings me to a lot of farms is just really evaluating: are we packing adequately? How is our storage system set up? Is it really set up to utilize the forages we have? I joke, maybe somewhat cynically, but I early in my career, and going back to the days when we were working on farms, there were a lot of barns being built, right? And I would often get the response from a farm as well: we're building another barn. That's where our resources are going. We'll worry about expanding our bunk some other time, because right now we're just going to keep kind of piling as much feed in there as we can, and for a number of reasons, especially here in the Northeast, we've been in a little cycle here for a few years with some challenges related to milk supply and demand, that a lot of farms are holding back on building more barns, but really looking for new areas to improve, right? Because they need to continually improve, even if they're not getting, expanding the operation. And so we often look, and rightfully so, we look at areas around cow comfort and other areas in the farm, which are, again, very well justified to look there for improving efficiencies on the farm. But I always like to remind folks that I'm working with, that if we're looking to reinvest in our farm and trying to get better without necessarily getting bigger, that our feed storage systems are a real opportunity area. And if we can become more refined in how many, say bunk silos we have and how we segregate each of our feeds at harvest, so, and knowing what silo they're in so that we're able to utilize them for the right group of animals at the right time and during the year, in contrast to having one large bunk where everything's kind of buried in there together. And we may know there's a really good feed in there that we'd like to feed to a group of animals, but it's buried under 2 months of other feed, right?
You can't get to it.
Yeah, you can't get to it. So I think that's a real opportunity area right now, as especially when the discussion is around how do we continue to get better without necessarily getting bigger sometimes.
Yeah. And I think that's a really great point of, one, the whole farm planning aspect, right? Through an expansion, what have you, is not only having enough feed, but, where's it going to be stored and how's it going to be stored? And then I think, your point of what opportunities there are also, feeding efficiency, working with quite a number of clients on new feeding centers, and just the whole goal, not only, maintaining quality through that process, reducing shrink, but feeder efficiency, right?
Mm-hmm.
On larger farms, the process of feeding can obviously take many hours. How can we make that process more efficient on not only the people but the equipment also, right?
Mm-hmm.
So some really cool opportunities, within that area. So Joe, as we wrap up, some really great conversation here, and hopefully some real cool discussions to get our listeners thinking here as they take advantage of the podcast.
It's time for our famous three. Evonik Animal Nutrition is committed to ensure food security and safety while reducing the ecological footprint of animal farming. Its products and services use evidence-based solutions that seek to promote animal welfare and reduce reliance on natural resources. All this is underpinned by long-standing industry partnerships and deep customer understanding. Evonik's focus on efficiency, sustainable, healthy nutrition, and collaborations with livestock farming partners creates value for customers and consumers.
I think you already answered, one of the wrap-up questions is what sets aside a progressive producer. I'll let you give your synopsis, but I think you already gave lots of different examples there that I can summarize. But what's your quick synopsis of the producers that you see set themselves apart from the others in terms of their being progressive and longevity in the industry?
Well, I think so. Being aware of your surroundings and utilizing the resources available to you. And I would also add on top of that, recognizing your strengths in the operation. So, as farms have changed over the years, and I just had this discussion with someone the other day that, maybe you're really strong in one area, but you've always had to do this other stuff. Well, now may be the time to say, I need to let that task go to someone or identify someone on the farm that has more strength there than I do. And so to me, those two things tie together is, kind of recognizing your surroundings and being self-aware of what your talents are and what you may be better off delegating to someone that has an interest in an area that might be more of a weakness for you.
No, excellent, and I think it's a great point. And then in terms of a reference that you use, a go-to for you, could be a journal, could be a website, could be some text, but that you find useful and that you would recommend to others in terms of the dairy industry.
Yeah. I still, well, as you mentioned, this is my second time participating, and I think I answered last time that podcasts are really actually something there. There's a number of good dairy oriented podcasts out there now, and given the time I put on the road, it's a really handy format to keep caught up. But beyond that, I continue to value what I get out of some of the traditional print magazines, and they're on, a lot of them have online versions now too, right? But just to um, help help with what the trends are in the industry, stuff like Hordes Dairyman and Progressive Dairy and Hay and Forage Grower magazine. There's good articles in there, and there's also often good indicators of what may be coming up, or shifts that are in people's interest in the industry.
No, that's a great point, and I think a lot of the online materials that are available now. I think since the pandemic, we just see in my inbox. I can't connect to all the webinars and podcasts that are. Fortunately, we could usually share them amongst our group, and can somebody connect to this and get the summary for us, because it looks like a really good program. Um, so that's a great point. And then I guess you maybe don't have much time to do other stuff. I know you got a young family and busy house projects that I could see you're working on all the time. But maybe when not 100% connected, is there anything recently that you've read, or documentary or something that non-dairy related that you can offer the audience?
Well, yeah, honestly, not no large reading projects or anything. I'll kind of go back to, I guess, two things. Kind of go back to the podcast, because they are so non-dairy podcasts are in my feed too, and because again, being busy with young kids and stuff, it's an opportunity, and I try to keep up just on the news and different multiple perspectives on the news. And I think as a both just as a personally and tied back to the dairy industry, is we have to recognize how consumer trends, how global events are affecting our industry, and I think there's a lot of good opportunities to you know you don't have to commit a lot of time, but there a lot of good news sources have kind of snapshots of the day, and so I find myself relying on those to both just keep up on current events, and also they do help bring perspective for me in terms of what kind of challenges are going to be facing our from a food production standpoint, and what type of effects some of these global events are having on the prices paid to farmers, whether that's the grain or milk or whatever. So so I try to stay connected that way.
Joe, I really appreciate that response. I think, years and years ago, I would always try to challenge some of my veterinary clients. This is a global industry. You need to think globally, not just regionally, not even just US, but um, also so much of the information that doesn't get to us, world events that people hear about are obviously media's has to have the big push or big bang, but was recently in Argentina for 2 weeks. And if you're in following grain markets and so forth, obviously the economy there is really important. But when do you really hear about the presidential election or the economy in Argentina in popular news? Hardly ever. But having lots of friends and colleagues and having been there, the economy there and all that's going on politically is not only something that's important to realize in terms of how an industry adapts, but also how that affects corn markets, for example. So
Mhm.
um, I really appreciate that comment. Let's think globally and all, because milk supply, forages, grains, obviously are look at Ukraine, for example,
Hmm.
and how that's affected the markets. So we can go on and on about that, Joe. But as we reach the top of the hour here, we obviously had no problem finding plenty to chat about. Look forward to seeing you sometime in the near future. And again, Joe Lawrence from Pro Dairy, Cornell Pro Dairy in Northern New York. Um, and with that, this is Mark Thomas signing off, and we'll look forward to connecting again soon on another dairy podcast show. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.